1, 2, 3, 4. I got thoughts running through my head. I got thoughts, can't you see? I got thoughts, books I read. I got thoughts, won't you listen to
One other story piece about the ending that I have to bring up is that the marionette's kid, or I keep calling her Marionette, but whatever her name is, Punch and Judy, I don't know. Her child, that supposedly Manhattan saved her because of the child, ends up being the Superman-ish, hopeful kind of character that the Watchmen universe needs, because at the end of it, he goes, the kid gets dropped off with Silk Spectre and Night Owl, who are happily married and have a daughter, and is raised by them. And I guess he becomes the Superman of that world, or the hopeful icon, or something. Again, it's a big, long, sloppy love letter kiss to Superman, and that's fine. It was well drawn, I mean, mostly well written, but just so unnecessary. And unnecessary mainly because it used those characters on the Watchmen characters, added nothing to the mythos, added nothing to the original story other than repudiating it, basically repudiating the tone of it, and extending the DC copyright stuff on it, so that Alan Moore never gets to own those creations that he was promised. And it just, I mean, it exists, and then it's gone. And that brings up kind of my point about brands, and about DC, the DC universe, the Marvel universe, these franchise characters. So one of the things I've always said, or in the last, I guess, decade, have said about writers who come on a comic book with an established character and fuck them all up. Or, there was a big trend for a while where we had to retcon a lot of the stuff, and some of it was good, and some of it was just retconning for the sake of it. I mean, I give the perfect example is the J. Michael Straczynski Spider-Man stuff, where he basically retconned that Gwen Stacy, before she died, went to Europe for like 9 months, a year, whatever, lived with the not dead Norman Osborn, Green Goblin, had an affair with him, and then had 2 kids. The kids grew up to have powers and all that. And thankfully, they've kind of just forgotten or ignored that in Spider-Man now. But, I mean, that is that kind of rehash of characters. When you're writing franchise characters, I don't want people to think that I'm advocating that writing should have limits. But that writing should have limits. And here's why. Like my Levi's t-shirt, Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, all that, they are brands. They have been around long enough, and they are a part of the popular lexicon for long enough that they have become icons, archetypes. And there's plenty of room with creative thinking for good stories using those brands and archetypes. Clearly there is, because there's good works being done all the time. Now, the more you read of it, the more you might figure that this is just rehashing this, or rehashing, well, nothing's original. And I'm fine with that. Even if you can't be original, you can at least be entertaining. And when you're talking about writing a brand, people that are not your, characters that are not yours, not your creation, that you're basically working off someone else's work, and expanding upon that, you do, in my opinion, as a writer, you do owe a debt to the person that created that character. If if I'm writing my Cthulhu series and I turn Cthulhu into a human being that has no godly powers, and is, an evangelical Christian who wants to save the universe, well, unless I'm writing a satire, that's not a good Cthulhu story. That's taking the brand and making it a whole something other else. It's a reimagining that is, polar opposite of what the Cthulhu mythos is. Same way if I take Spider-Man and, turn him into an invulnerable villain. It's not really the character. It's not the essence of the character. When you're doing brands, when you're working with brands, you do owe a responsibility to the brand's history. Whether you remake that history, rejigger that history, whatever you want to do, you still have to write, draw, whatever with some eye to that history. And Watchmen is no different. Those characters are now somewhat iconic, but even before they were iconic, they were just such, the story was just so complete, it didn't need a sequel, it didn't need spin-offs, it didn't need any of that. As I said, the Damon Lindelof TV show was actually a decent sequel once you got into it, and if you could take some of the changes or some of the concepts behind it, if you weren't, opposed to those. But he didn't suddenly turn, Rorschach into a good guy. He didn't. He respected that original character, I think his version of Silk Spectre as an older woman who's, tired of the vigilante thing and who's, recognized that her father was the comedian. I think that was a good evolution of that character. But brands, the characters, that's part of the problem with superhero comics having become so iconic, is that they are brands, and you can't stray, as a writer, you can't stray too far from the brand. You can't evolve too far, and if you do, at some point it becomes something else entirely, and you maybe lose the ability to do some of the things you could do with it as a brand. A good example of that would be when Spider-Man got married. That was a good evolution. I liked it. I thought, I'm not a huge Spider-Man fan, but I thought, hey, that's cool. We've moved Spider-Man forward. And great, it's been 30 years. Let him get married finally. So he did. And then Joe Quesada comes along, doesn't like that, and eventually retcons it away with the whole one more day thing. Now, I hated that story. But I will admit that it did, set up some good stories for later with the Dan Slott stuff, with the Superior Spider-Man, and then the Spider-Man when he came back to life. Again, if you don't know any of these references, you can look them up if you really are inclined. So the brand aspect of the Doomsday Clock thing has felt just off completely. The story is off brand. The whole kind of, we have to have morality, we have to have consequences for Ozymandias and the people who did this bad thing. It also falls apart when you don't have consequences inflicted upon Silk Spectre and Night Owl, because they're just fine at the end of the Doomsday Clock book, and they have a new hopeful son, but they were almost as much of a part of 3 million people dying in New York as Ozymandias was. By, just by not telling people about it. So, in that sense, it was weird. But speaking of brands, the Doomsday Clock thing being the whole impetus behind the rebirth always felt odd to me from a branding aspect. But it's something that both DC and Marvel have suffered from for years, is the meta-narrative problem. The more books you put out, the more stories you create, the more continuity you create with those brands, and the more those brands become constricted by this has happened, and of course you can't grow new readers that way if if they have to read 500 back issues to understand what's going on in today's comic, they're not going to jump on. And that's part of the reason many people probably don't read comics. They just will watch the Marvel movies, because even the Marvel movies are starting to stretch the continuity, because Endgame took a lot of that and put it together. But again, it did it better than I ever thought it could. Now we'll see where they go after that. But this meta-narrative problem has been a problem for quite a while. And I will say that the solution to it started with Crisis on Infinite Earths. The original comic book, not the TV show that just ended. As an aside, I love the TV show. It was total fan service wank, but loved it because I am a fan. It was just cool seeing some of that stuff. So, Crisis on Infinite Earths was in the mid to late 80s. 12-issue miniseries that was meant to take all the continuity of the DC multiverse. DC had, Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, billion Earths. And pare out the stuff that they're not using anymore and redo the universe. So it was a relaunch of the universe. And it worked. I mean, The Crisis on Infinite Earths was a good series, especially considering what it had to deal with. I mean, we're talking about thousands of characters that it had to show something on, even if it's just one little panel. And George Perez managed that perfectly. But it compressed the DC universe into one universe. No Earth 2, Justice Society and Justice League was part of the same universe. All that. Now, and again, this is all very nerdy comic discussions. But again, it was necessitated by the fact that those were brands with, at the time, 50 years worth of continuity. Batman had been around for 50 years. And even though they sort of did a reboot in from the Golden Age to the Silver Age in the 60s, where they changed Flash's costume and made Flash Barry Allen and all that kind of stuff, it wasn't done in the same way, because at the time, shared universes weren't even thought of. It was just, okay, I'm a DC comic, and here's Batman with a guest star. Didn't really worry about continuity. And continuity became a big thing in the 80s. I don't know why, but it was, and suddenly it became a big thing to me. So Crisis on Infinite Earths was meant to clean up that continuity. And I think part of it was because a lot of the fans at the time made fun of DC because of all that continuity. They said, oh, Marvel doesn't have that. Marvel has it now, because there's 30 years since then that Marvel's had stuff. It's been around 50 years. So at various points during the time since Crisis, there have been big events that were meant to fix continuity. Infinite Crisis, written by Jeff Johns, was one such version that also had the meta-narrative problem, in that the inconsistencies with some characters like Hawkman from Crisis to the after Crisis, post-Crisis, was explained away within the narrative as the Superboy of Earth Prime punching at the walls of his prison. Continuity punches. That's how Jason Todd is alive, even though he was dead. And yeah, it was continuity punches. I mean, it's as good an explanation as anything else. It's comic books. We can do silly explanations sometimes. That one, But Infinite Crisis marked a different change, and then we had Flashpoint that went to New 52 and Rebirth and all that. And all of these are basically, well, number one, they're crossovers, so they're meant to sell books, for the year. But they're also meant to launch new titles and change direction of a shared universe. But again, all they're doing is trying to update the brands to match the reader's current, taste and sensibilities, or what they think it is. Or in some cases, it's creators who are, who hate these creations or hate this aspect of the creation and want to change it, like Joe Quesada wanted to change Spider-Man being married back in the day. I don't really know where I was going with that. I just kind of like talking about it. Again, this is just me having thoughts. But as a final kind of overview, branding of iconic characters, I'm fine with it. I mean, again, I have read plenty of good stories with iconic characters that I might not otherwise follow for 100 issues, just because this run was good. And it generally is. It's generally the creator and not the character. What does the creator do with that character? Superman doesn't need a love letter written to him. He's been around forever and will be probably, and according to this book, he'll be around for 1,000,000 years. Superman has been around, you know, coming up closely on 100 years. I mean, it's been 80 years. He'll still be around for a while as long as people will pay money to read him. He's an iconic brand. He's an archetype. He can have interesting stories written about him if the creators give a crap and want to. And they don't all have to be, here's how we destroy Superman, or here's how we change Superman to be, oh, he can kill now, to be the objectivist hero in Man of Steel. I mean, as long as there are good creators writing it, who are trying to make entertaining stories, there can be good stories written about any characters, I believe. You could take these crap-ass Twilight characters, and you could make an interesting story around them if you just, made an interesting story, as opposed to just trying to write, fan fiction for bored housewives. Or, lovesick tweens. And even that, I mean, I'm dissing them, but somebody likes them somewhere, so they sold more books than I have. So, that's my take on Doomsday Clock. It's an interesting read. Like I said, the artwork is great. There's, so I mean, the artwork is great. And it's an interesting take on, it's an interesting pantomime of, the Watchmen style, both writing stylistically and the artwork. I just don't think it's necessary. It's a weird mishmash that, in the DC universe, doesn't seem to have had any impact whatsoever. So in that sense, in the fixing continuity sense, I don't know why it exists. I mean, you could have easily just said, put a letter from the editor saying this is why Superman has done this. It's all meta. We didn't need a 12-issue miniseries of that. If you are interested in it, though, take a read. I'm not saying you're going to hate it. You might hate it, but it's not the worst thing I've read. That's certainly true. Well, that's my take on Doomsday Clock, and I believe that ends my discussion on Watchmen, although who knows, I could get another idea when I'm walking the dog or something. Next, I will try to finally sit down and record my thoughts on If Tribe Equals. I got the feeling that one's going to be a long one, so I've kind of been holding off on it, although I really need to move forward on it. If you've got any comments, just leave them down below. Subscribe to the channel if you like this. I got a whole bunch of other author thought videos on my books, and I'll probably, when I get an idea or want to review something, I'll just make a Various and Sundry that says, hey, I'll review this or review that. And if you want to hear me talk about anything, in particular, come in the comments. I'm there. My name is Gary Ballard. I am the author, and this has been my thoughts.